What you see here are 4 slide rules marketed by the Frederick Post Company in the United States during and after World War II. The one at the bottom was made by Versalog II. It was made during the war, and over on the left or the right hand side it says made in USA. We'll look at these a little closer in a minute. This is the oldest of this set of rules. This was made during the war. The next 3 were made by Son Hemi of Japan after the war, once again for Frederick Post. This is the 1462, this is the 1462H, the H meaning Hemi. You may notice, however, that this is a completely different rule. It's a bit wider. It's not just this rule copied, it's a complete redesign. Then the next one up is the 1460, often called the Versalog. And this also was made by Son Hemi, as was the one at the top. So you may notice that the numbers go 1462, 1462H, 1460. It's like they're sliding backwards. And then this one was also called the 1460, even though it has scales and other things that this one does not have. Some people referred to this, and in some of their marketing materials, Frederick Post referred to this as the Versalog II. This was sort of the epitome of the Post slide rules, Frederick Post slide rules. Now, as I pointed out in an earlier video, to the best of my knowledge, Post never made slide rules. They just sold them. As in this case, Versalog II, which was an American company, even though it sounds like it should be a French company, made this rule during World War II. And then after the war, Son Hemi made this one, then this one, and finally this one, which they continued to market until the end of the slide rule era. So let's take a little closer look at some of these rules and see if we can see what the advances were over the years. This is the left end, or the legend end, if you will, of the 1462. Notice that at the top it has a tangent scale, then the 2 typical folded scales, the DF and CF. Below it is the CIF, that's the inverted C folded scale. In other words, it's CF, but starting from the right to the left instead of from the left to the right. Below that is the CI scale, which is the C scale inverted. Then C, D, S, and ST. Now, the T, S, and ST scales were for trig functions, sine, tangent. T is for tangent, S for sine, and ST is for sine tangent. We'll turn it over and take a look at the back side. And there you see the A, B, K, L, C in black. What you may have trouble seeing are the 2 scales at the top. This is LL0 and LL00. This was one of the early log-log rules. A little easier to see because it's in black ink at the bottom are LL3, 2, and 1, and those are log-log scales. Now, one of the things about this rule that is unique, or not unique, but at least different from the other rules, these log-log scales, the ones at the top, are keyed to the A and B scales, not to the C and D scales. As a result, if you try to move from these scales to these scales, like when doing hyperbolic functions, which I won't get into, but that involves taking e to the x and e to the minus x. Well, you take e to the minus x up here and e to the x down here, but unfortunately, since this is tied to the A and B scales, and these are tied to the C and D scales, and there is no D scale down here, by the way, so you must align the C scale precisely, the index, if you want to read from the lower scales to the C scale. These are some of the drawbacks that the 1462 had. This now is the 1462H, which was referred to as the post trig. And once again, the tangent scale at the top, the two folded scales, the C inverted folded scale, the C inverted scale, C, D, S, and ST. This side of the rule was called the trig side, and occasionally Post referred to this side of the rule as the power side. So sometimes this rule was referred to as the power trig rule. On this one you can see the LL0 and LL00 a little easier. Then A, B, K, L, C, LL3, LL2, LL1. And those are the same scales as on the 1462, but the difference is this one was made by Sun Hemi in Japan. We turn it over on this side, you can see that at the very top. Sun Hemi, made in occupied Japan. Occupied Japan means that it was made between the end of the war and 1950. Because shortly after the Korean conflict broke out, the requirement to label occupied Japan on rules or on anything coming from Japan was removed. So that was the 1462H, a much better rule, although it really had many of the same scales and features of the 1462, but a much better built rule. It was made of bamboo with a laminate, the engraved scales, and a better cursor, etc. This is the power or log side, or one side, of the rule with log-log scales at the top. In this case, it's log-log 0 and log-log/0. And what that means is the log-log/0 means e to the negative numbers, in other words, 1 over e to a power. And the black scale is just e to the power. Then below that, the K, DF, CF, CIF, DI, or CI I mean, CD, and then two new scales, and below that is the L. The two new scales are for square roots. Now previously you always did squares and square roots with the A scale, but this slide rule, you notice, does not have an A scale, but it replaces them with these two square root scales. If you would like to know a little more about how these work, there's a nice video by Professor Herning on his YouTube channel about that. I'm not going to go into those here because this is mainly a historical retrospective, but nonetheless, these were new scales. On the trig side, on the power side, we just looked at the trig side. On the power side, you see that they've added some legends on the left. They've expanded the number of log-log scales, but actually the range of these log-log scales and the range of the ones on the 1462 are the same. This is often called the 1460 Versalog. And in addition to these log-log scales, the same three down here, the difference being that now these scales, as well as these, all refer to the C and D. There is a T scale, an ST scale, which also has markings for secant, a cosine scale and a sine. The other rule, of course, had a sine scale, but it didn't have the cosine markings. And this one, the cosine markings are in green. Then the C and D, and as I say, the log-log scales. This was one of the most popular rules that Post sold. And looking at the other end, you'll see that it just says Post. However, if you turn the rule up on end, you'll see that the cursor is marked Hemi Japan, and on this side it's marked Post, and then Versalog, and right there is the model number 1460. So this is the first Versalog rule. Here is the one side of the Versalog II. Notice that one difference from the Versalog is the addition of this A scale. I said that the Versalog, the original Versalog, did not have an A or a B scale. This one does not have a B scale, but it does have an A scale. Now, this rule and the other Sun Hemi rules were also marketed in Japan under Sun Hemi names that varied. So, for example, I believe this one was marketed under the 258, Hemi 258 number. I'm going to separate the Sun Hemi rules in this retrospective. I was going to do them together with the Post because there was such a close relationship between the two companies. But I decided, because the number of Sun Hemis is would run these up to 10 or 12 rules, that to separate them into two different videos. So here you see you have the LL0 scale on this side, then the K, and notice there's legends now that tell you what these mean. K is the cube scale, then is the A scale, which is X squared, or the square scale. Then DF and CF, the folded C and D scales, which are basically folded at pi, which allows you to multiply something on D by pi by simply going up to the DF scale and so on. Then the CIF, which is just the inverted, in other words, 1 over pi x. The CI itself, which is 1 over x, in other words, the inverted C scale. Then C and D. Once again, the root scales are here. These are square root scales. And finally, at the bottom, LL0. Now let's go over to the power side. And they had stopped calling this the power trig by the time the 1460 was made. But nonetheless, on this side you see at the top the L scale, which is logarithms. Then 3 log-log scales. The difference between a logarithm scale and a log-log scale, by the way, a logarithm is just 1 log. In other words, it's the log of the number read on the D scale. An LL scale is the log of what's on the D scale. That's why it's called log-log. In this case, it's the log to the base 10 of the log to the base E of D. Then below that is the T and SRT, the sine, cosine scales, as we've talked about. Then the X, and finally the log-log 1, 2, and 3 scales. Once again, all of these relate to the D scale. In other words, the log-log is related to the D scale itself. Now, if we slide out to the end over here, we see at the top it says Hemi, and down here Japan. If we turn this over, we see it is the Versalog 1460. Now notice the difference. On the Versalog II, the 1460 is placed here on the body of the rule and Post on the slide. If you recall, the Versalog, the original Versalog, I'll show you that one again, had the name Versalog and the 1460 written on the side of the body. So this is a bit of an overview of the Post slide rules. While I have a few of these, and I really like the Versalog II, the Post is not well, let's say it's not the rule that I tend to collect, and so I have probably the fewest of those. But if you add in the Sun Hemis, which I will be talking about in a future video, then you'll see that I really liked the rules made by Hemi, especially the specialty rules that Sun Hemi made for electrical engineering, which I'll talk about as well in a future video. Before I wrap up this video, I thought I would mention that there's a very good article in the Journal of the Outread Society. You can find it either by looking for Outread. I think it's spelled O-U-G-H-T-E-D or O-U-G-H-T-R-E-D. Volume 9, number 2, from the fall of 2000. You can find this on the Outread Society's website, or if you go to the Slide Rule Museum, the International Slide Rule Museum, and go to the Frederick Post section, they have a link to the Outread Society, and you'll eventually get to this article. It's a very nice article on the Post slide rules and the history and those sorts of things. Another thing I did want to mention is most of the Post slide rules came in holsters. I think some of them were sold in boxes, but mostly in holsters. This is one of the better holsters. This is the one for the Versalog II that I showed earlier. And finally, there are some books. This is one of the instruction books that came with the one of the Post slide rules. Now, this is one of the books from the war years, and so it's relatively it's paperback, and it's printed on fairly cheap paper, but of course there were some restrictions and shortages during that time. After the war, Post did produce some very nice books. This is one from the original Versalog, the one that I showed you, that's the 1460, but not the Versalog II. Then later, they published one like this for the Versalog II, but very shortly after that, they went to a paperback format like this. And so those are some of the resources that you can find. Finally, on the I think it's the International Slide Rule Museum website, they have a nice chart of Post slide rules that has a lot more information that I gave in this short video. So you might want to look for that. They also have similar kinds of charts for many of the other slide rules that they talk about. But I hope this retrospective of the Frederick Post Company and their slide rules, at least from World War II to the end of the slide rule era, will be interesting to you. You'll look forward to some of the future videos, and in the meantime, have a nice day.